Hello and welcome to #AskBen Part 4. I had a lot of video ideas to choose from this week, but ultimately I decided that I needed to complete the #AskBen video that I promised at the end of December. So without further ado, I have quite a few questions to respond to, so let's get into them. Starting off, we have a question from Franklin Orrick, who wants to know if I have seen anything unexplained or metaphysical in nature, possibly a cryptid or something paranormal. He asks this since I not only seem to enjoy cryptids, but respect the culture enough to keep things professional as I can, even while debunking some stories. Tying in with this, Finn Phantom asked a similar question about what cryptids I've seen in my life. Thank you, Franklin Orrick and Finn Phantom. Over the years, I've discussed a lot of my paranormal encounters, many of which are part of my series known as Personal Paranormal. Speaking of which, I really need to take time and fix my channel's playlists. They are a bit of a mess. Anyway, I have had a lot of sightings in my life, but they are all predominantly of the spirit variety. In fact, my very first avenue into the paranormal world came by my grandfather talking to me when I was around 6 to 8 years old. Mind you, that he has been deceased since my dad was 6 or 8 years old. The activity only grew from there, to where we frequently have interactions with ghosts in our life, but it has almost become a normal thing. My father, and come to find out many of his bloodline, all have seen many types of UFOs, going back to sightings from my great-great-grandfather. Sadly, I have only seen 2 UFOs, with one being plain as day looking like a triangular-shaped craft, while the other was a neon green light that fell straight from the sky, that I can only liken to looking akin to dripping glass. With cryptids I have seen, let's call it 2.5. There was a strange alien-looking being that I saw in the forest between Parker Dam and S.B. Elliott State Parks. At first, I was convinced it could have been a chupacabra, but as time has worn on, I wonder if it was actually the recently sighted creature known as a crawler. Or it could have simply been an extraterrestrial. The other sighting was a creature I thought was pure myth, which is the brownie. Up until that point, I never gave much credence to creatures of the Fae, but after my sighting, I now know I was wrong. The last one I consider a half, since I am convinced that when I was around 16, I saw a Sasquatch. At this time, I spent most of my free time in the forests around our house, and one day I heard a snapping sound coming from across the other side of the river. When I looked up, I saw an elbow and back leg disappearing behind a tree. The odd thing was that the being was incredibly tall, but I recall that the arm and leg both had a similar dark blue color and sheen, like the satin jackets you used to see in pictures from the 80s. I would have assumed it was someone trying to sneak up on me, but the height and the fact that the color was the same on the arms as it was on the leg leads me to believe otherwise. Since I am not 100% certain of this one, I consider it a half sighting. I appreciate your statement that I respect the cryptid culture and keeping things professional even while debunking. I do have a lot of love for the creatures and stories. I try to not flat out debunk an old story, since there are enough people out there who will cry hoax without a second thought. Even if the evidence says as much, I like to keep the possibility of something being real open. A lot of times you will find 20 reports from a sighting, but when you look at it, 19 of those were from people just trying to gain fame, whereas the original first report was a valid sighting. Once those 19 reports are found to be a hoax, many rule the entire event a scam. However, this may not be the case, although I will admit, sometimes it is. Next up we have Country by Fire, who wants to know what types of cryptids Scotland has, as well as ones the Vikings told tales about. Gerbil13 is also curious if we will see a Scottish video. Thank you for your questions, Country by Fire and also Gerbil13. I normally try to give quite an in-depth answer to most of your questions, but this one, I really can't. Simply put, and with this I answer Gerbil13's question, I will be making a video about Scotland in our Cryptid by Region series. This has always been the plan all along, but I can't give an exact time frame as to when this is going to happen. Now, a video about the cryptids of the Vikings would be an interesting topic. Also, I think it would be possible to make it a standalone video. The only issue is that the Vikings had a lot of beings that were never seen as flesh and blood animals, but were more of a myth, even for them. Although it is important to note that they did originate tales of the famed squid-like beast, known famously as the Kraken. Space Policeman of Space talked to me about if I thought the world had some type of veil over it, of which I replied that I did. Then he followed up, wondering if any activities such as cryptids, UFOs, and spirits are also part of that veil. Thank you, Space Policeman of Space. This is a fascinating question, and one that deserves a lot of consideration. Let me start off by saying that I do see the possibility that the world we see is veiled in a way that blocks us from the other realms. I don't know this for sure, but I certainly think that there could be other, for a lack of a better word, dimensions out there. This would fit in perfectly with so many creatures appearing and then vanishing from sight. In these instances, it could be moments where our realities mix with theirs. As such, we are only briefly able to see these beings. I also feel that the Mothman is an interdimensional being, and recent theories clearly point to the Sasquatch being one as well. It is moments like these that remind me of a conversation I had with Mike Ricksecker from Haunted Road Media. He investigates haunted locations, but in one incident he said that he walked through a door and saw a shadow person. At that moment, the shadow person ran away, almost as if it was terrified of Mike's presence. This opened the fascinating idea that maybe in this shadow person's realm, Mike was seen as the ghost, and it scared the being. It is possible in that moment our realities merged, and both Mike and the shadow could see each other. It almost reminds me of the premise behind the movie from 2001 called The Others. I hate to spoil it, but the movie's 20 years old now. In it, the mother and children are plagued by ghosts and strange events, until it is revealed that they are the ghosts, and the activity they had encountered was from people who now owned the house and were trying to rid it of all spirit activity that they had seen. Jeffrey Hoover wants to know if I think spirits can possess or be attached to vehicles. Thank you for your question, Jeffrey. Are you asking in relation to movies such as Maximum Overdrive, Christine, and The Car? In all seriousness, this is a bit of a tricky subject. Many will point out that spirits do tend to become attached to objects, and then can cause activity to happen around the location it now resides. The problem is that not a lot of discussion is given to how this happens or what it requires. With that said, I could see it being possible that a person who owned the vehicle could in some way attach themselves to it. What this would mean to the new owner, I'm unsure. Even though I was joking at the beginning, I don't recall reading any stories about a car operating on its own. I think that when it comes to attachment, the object needs a spirit to cause activity. So either the spirit stays with the object and causes problems in the new living situation, or in some way the object opens a portal for spirits to arrive. Now, I would be remiss not to mention the obvious stories about curses being placed on vehicles, such as James Dean's Porsche, which the activity could all be strange coincidence or flat out paranormal. In this case, I don't believe the car was cursed to begin with, but rather the tragedy was the result of a reckless driver. Although going down that road, there are plenty of stories about ghost cars and even houses. The whole concept seems to really baffle the paranormal field. So, long story short, I think it is possible for anything to have a spirit attached, but I don't really think it is anything to be afraid of. To date, I can't find a single story, outside the movies, of a vehicle coming to life and harming someone. At most, the radio might act funny or the car may not start. Yet, as I say that, I remember stories about a ghost truck that is said to drive on the super haunted Clinton Road in New Jersey that is said to ram people off the road. BB7738 states that Thunderbirds are frequently tied to North American origins. Is this strictly a New World beastie, or are there reports of this cryptid in Europe and Asia, but under a different name? Thank you for the question, Barry. Yes, traditionally, the Thunderbird is seen as an important character in many Native American stories. However, They aren't the only ones who had these legends. After reading this question, I immediately thought about the harpies and even cockatrices from the Greeks and Romans respectively. The Hungarians had a large legendary bird known as the turtle, and in Mesopotamia, Anzu fits the bill quite nicely. We also can bring in the roc from Arabia, but as per your question, Asia does have quite a few stories about large birds. There are many more examples of creatures like this found all over the world, but I think the most spot-on description comes from South Africa, and it is called Ipendulu, or lightning bird. There are minor differences, such as it being seen as a vampire and possibly a familiar, but it is said to be the size of a human, and more importantly, can create lightning bolts from its wings. Actually, from looking at the lore behind a lot of these birds, you find that many stories claim that they can control the weather. Jay Kali wants my opinion on the LBL werewolf incident. Do I think it is a real story or mere fiction? Thank you for your question, Jay Kali. I remember coming across the werewolf dogman story from the land between the lakes when I made the Cryptid by State video for Kentucky. This area is known to be a very beautiful location, but it also is fairly spooky in its own rights. To this day, many who have entered the forest claim the uneasy feeling that they are being watched or even followed. Now, when you mention the incident, it can involve many stories, such as the college students who claimed that they were chased out of the woods by the creature and even had their car clawed up. Also, it could be the story from the 1900s, where signs of a strange creature attack was evident on a family farm. However, I am assuming you are talking about the police being called to the scene where they found a family's camper destroyed and bits and pieces of their body being found sprawled all over the campground. As the story goes, this was all covered up to not cause panic or hurt tourism. Now, I agree that a lot of those stories sound really fantastic and possibly over-exaggerated. Especially figuring that I can't find images of the clawed up car the college students had, and how did a covered up story become so well known? Although I must admit, it reminds me of a similar event that happened out west where a Bigfoot supposedly did the same thing, and it was covered up. As such, finding that story today is hard to come by. Personally, I feel that it is likely that some of the details behind the stories were embellished, but I can't refute the fact that dogman sightings seem fairly prominent in that area. Not to mention that lore claims that these beings are in fact skinwalkers. I look at it this way: if I'm willing to accept that a dogman is present in the dense forest, then why not agree that one could be more violent than most? Isabet, just Isabet, was curious if I thought it was possible for non-human beings to live amongst us without being noticed. Thank you for your question, Isabet. I absolutely think that this is possible. Of course, many would immediately think about the idea of reptilians walking about wearing a human-looking skin. While I won't rule that out, there are other possible examples of this behavior that don't rely on the disguise. On Mount Shasta, stories exist of locals frequently coming across individuals that are abnormally tall and pay for their goods that they want to buy with jewels and gold chunks. Obviously, these beings are assumed to be part of the race of people who are said to reside in the mountain. This also ties with the idea that there possibly is an advanced race of humans who removed themselves from our civilization and remain shrouded in secrecy from the world unless they choose to interact. This idea goes with the realization that our ancestors seem to become really technologically advanced, and then suddenly all major progress seemed to stop for quite a period of time. The theory is that those humans chose to remove themselves from the rest of us and live on their own. Actually, just today, I was thinking about aliens, and thought, what if they don't look like the common bug-eyed depiction that we frequently see? What if aliens actually looked very similar to us, and as such, they could intermingle without anyone realizing anything was out of place? Mark the Demystifier and Radioactive Jealousy Support wants to know, why do people think that the Anunnaki are aliens? Also, what parallels exist between modern alien sightings and ancient fairies? Thank you for your question, Mark. I want to start by saying that I must admit that I am not well versed in the Anunnaki as other topics. As such, my opinion is merely that, and there are plenty of experts who have gone into full explanations behind them. From what I can tell, the Anunnaki have had a great presence in many cultures' ancient lore. Their origin differs between views, but all seem to be fairly advanced and, more importantly, involved with human daily life. Due to this, they were viewed as a form of God or godlike being. With many ancient alien theorist ideals, any being that played a part in helping human civilization were smarter than us, and more importantly, reportedly came from the heavens, could only mean that they were aliens. While it is possible that those ideas are right, it also is important to realize that many cultures had stories about many things that actually didn't play a part in life. More often than not, they were ways to describe things that were yet unknown to them. As for the second part of your question, I think the differences between aliens and the Fae greatly outweigh the similarities. Both beings come in different sizes and are normally described as looking like humans, but not quite. Another aspect is that the beings of the Fae are seen as protectors of nature and have always been here before humans stepped foot on the dirt. In many scenarios, people state that aliens actually started here on Earth, moved on, and are now coming back. It also is important to note that many claim that aliens are concerned with how humans have treated the planet. Both beings have been known to be capable of altering time, and have a penchant for abducting humans from time to time. So those are the similarities that I think best link the two beings. Victor Volkov wants to know my thoughts on haunted submarines in World War I, particularly the UB-65 and the ghost of its first officer. Thank you, Victor. This is a tough one, because I'm a huge fan of ghost ships and haunted ships, but submarines is a new one. For those unaware, the German U-boat called the UB-65 had quite an interesting history and even more interesting end. While being constructed, 5 workers lost their lives due to accidents. A crew member got swept overboard and lost during a routine check, and Second Lieutenant Richter was later killed with a torpedo that hit the craft. Richter's ghost was then seen multiple times after this, standing on the bow with his arms crossed. The story also goes that on June 30th, 1918, an American submarine called the L-2 was patrolling around Ireland when they came across UB-65. Just as they were preparing to fire, the German sub exploded for no apparent reason. Jumping ahead 50 years, a man named Sven Morgens Larsen and his wife June were sailing off the coast of Ireland when suddenly they heard an explosion and saw a submarine emerge from the water with the number 65 written on it, and it promptly sunk back under the waves. Allegedly, the pair were unaware of the history of UB-65 and were shocked to find out the story of the craft once they made land. The problem with all that is that many credit a journalist by the name of Hector Charles Bywater for many of the stories about this fabled craft. Some of the deaths were true, but others were not. In fact, the famed ghost of the man named Richter didn't exist. Well, not in the ship. His name was pulled from a pamphlet that circulated around the same time, where he was responsible for trying to convince people that an attack from space by Venusians was imminent. This story also found its way into the popular Fate magazine. Now, with all that said, the World War II era USS Kavala is said to have spirit activity including strange noises and even sights of shadow people playing checkers. Our final question comes from my good friend Daniel Bishop. He found stories about pioneers seeing a 4 to 5 foot tall, hairy, fast-moving sloth-like creature in the Rocky Mountains. He was curious if I knew anything about it. Thank you, Daniel. To be honest, I wasn't aware of this story, and I really need to devote more time into researching it. At first glance, I would have assumed that the creature described could have been a juvenile Sasquatch, which had been seen in the area. Although it is worth noting that the Jefferson's ground sloth, which was part of the Megalonyx family of giant sloths, did live in the Rocky Mountains. This version was about 9 to 10 feet tall, was faster than a normal sloth, and didn't die off that long ago. In fact, members of the same family are still reportedly seen in South America. So maybe pioneers were seeing the last remaining one in the Rockies. So as I end this, I wanted to thank everyone for giving me such interesting questions. As such, I hope that I was able to answer them as fully as you had hoped. If you haven't yet done so, do please consider subscribing to my channel for more content like this. Also, it would be greatly appreciated if you share my videos with someone you know who may be interested in this type of genre. With that, be safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Later.